What is the excuse? What is the reason that you let all of these people into the country?
Whilst I do think there was a lack of appropriate rigour when it came to really driving down on immigration when we were in government, I also genuinely think, and this is a slightly more depressing contention, that it was cock-up rather than conspiracy.
Why should the British public vote for a party that has lied to them in 5 elections? And you're saying to them, trust us on just the 6th time lucky, we'll get it right. These are the people who have suffered, in fact, not just suffered, they've lost their lives as a result of government failure, as a result of your government's failure, systemic failure. You blame judges, you say it would have been impossible for the government to do these things because of a court in Strasbourg. You accept that Parliament is sovereign, and you accept that the Conservative Party had a majority in Parliament. Therefore, it was on you guys. It was up to you to stop these things from happening. Look, thank you so much, Simon, for joining us. I really appreciate
not at all
your time. So I want to jump straight into it. Obviously, you were a Conservative Member of Parliament, a minister for some years. I want to talk about the Tory legacy, why people should trust you again. So let's start with the big issue, immigration. In 2010, 2015, 2017, you promised to cut immigration to the tens of thousands. In 2019, you promised to reduce immigration. What actually happened?
Immigration consistently went up. And that is the single biggest reason, bar none, why we lost the election. It was, ironically, something which Onward, the think tank I now run, having lost my job in 2024, pointed out in a very major piece of polling conducted shortly after the election. But in truth, it was blindingly obvious for many of us for years that we needed to grip it. It was, I believe, the principal reason why people voted to leave the European Union in 2016. And we did not grip it. There are really no excuses, I think, is the honest truth. I mean, there are things you can say which are true. For example, that we offered sanctuary to the Hong Kongers, after Chinese repression, that we offered sanctuary to the Afghans after the Americans pulled the rug from under the government there. But the overarching truth is that we did not choose to grip that issue, and we consistently found reasons why it was something we wanted to do, but not yet. That there was always another reason, another sector which just needed a bit higher level of migration, whether that was the health service, whether that was social care, whether that was the education sector, particularly the universities. And that's why we lost. I think it's probably why we deserve to lose. And that is a really difficult thing to say, because, I really hate the current government. I think it's dreadful. But I do also recognise that we simply ran out of excuses as to why we didn't deliver.
So those were 4 elections that you won on that promise and did not deliver, as you say. And add that to the Brexit referendum. As you say, all about immigration. Is it fair enough to say that this was a betrayal of your voters?
I think that language probably is fair. I think we did let people down very badly on that issue, and I apologise for it, because it was not acceptable, and it's the thing, I think, which I find hardest to forgive, because some of the other things that happened, COVID coming out of a clear blue sky, the horrors of lockdown, that was dreadful, but it was a genuine externality. It was something we could not have anticipated. The immigration thing, we did know about, and we didn't act on.
So these are some of the numbers. You talked about Hong Kongers coming in and Ukrainians, and I know that's an excuse that Priti and others like to talk about when they're asked about this. But it wasn't just Hong Kongers or Ukrainians.
It wasn't.
Since 2021, 1 million Indians, 500,000 Nigerians, 289,000 Pakistanis, 84,000 Ghanaians, 93,000 Zimbabweans, 750,000 people from sub-Saharan Africa, 113,000 from Bangladesh, came to Britain between 2020 and 2024. What is the excuse? What is the reason that you let all of these people into the country?
Well, I think there's a variety of reasons. As I said a moment ago, certain sectors made specific appeals, which were items of policy. So the health and social care visa, there was a shortage where it was decided to create this dedicated visa route, and it was opened up, and the scale at which it was set allowed six-figure numbers into the United Kingdom. Likewise, for years, the university sector has made special pleading about the fact that we don't take foreign graduates in, then it will collapse, as though somehow the state should exist to prop up rubbish universities rather than that rubbish universities should, frankly, close, which is my view. So there were definite sort of policy exceptions that were made deliberately, but then there was a wider thing, which is that as we left the European Union and created the Australian-style points-based system, the Home Office clearly did not know how to set that number appropriately, because the level at which the earnings threshold, for example, was set was clearly much too low, and the willingness to allow dependents to accompany people who were coming in to work or study was clearly far too high. And, whilst I do think there was a lack of appropriate rigour when it came to really driving down on immigration when we were in government, I also genuinely think, and this is a slightly more depressing contention, that it was cock-up rather than conspiracy, that the Home Office simply as a department did not understand what it was setting in motion in the aftermath of leaving the European Union, because the great bulk of the immigration that occurred in the last parliament, as you say, was extra-European immigration. And that fundamentally arose because we did not know, as we ought to have done, what we were doing.
If you speak to someone like Suella Braverman, who was in the Home Office, you're talking a lot about the Home Office.
Yeah.
She would say, actually, it was the Treasury that was demanding more immigration. It was Treasury and OBR that said we need immigration to fill shortages and labour shortages and so on. And she was the only minister around that cabinet table that was arguing against immigration. Everyone else was saying, I need it in my department, health, whatever. I need immigrants to fill shortages here and there and whatever. You were in the Treasury, so shouldn't you take some responsibility for that?
I think the Home Office as a department is broken. And so I was the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, and my responsibility during that period was clearly to hold departments to account against their stated objectives, particularly obviously from a financial point of view. And the most depressing visits were those I made to the Home Office, because it just felt like a department where the cost implications, for example, of asylum accommodation were just not under control. It stood out as a department where you came away unconvinced that they really had the requisite degree of grip. I mean, there are lots of other problems across government: MOD procurement, health service, budget control. There are many things which are difficult to deliver, but the Home Office stood out for me as the one where it felt like there was the least control. It is obviously, though, equally fair to say that the Treasury and the OBR have for many years scored the benefits of migration in a way which makes it a rational choice for that to be pursued, and makes it harder for government as a whole to say, actually, no, we want much lower or even, effectively zero or net negative levels of migration. And, there's been some good work done on the true through-life costs of low-skilled migrants. And whilst you do get a sort of initial sugar rush sometimes from having people in the workforce, when you model what happens when you factor in their kids' education, their healthcare needs, the costs of everything ranging from interpreters to social care, then of course those figures look very different, and in many cases they start to become dramatically net negative from a fiscal point of view, let alone the social point of view. And Treasury does, I think, bear some responsibility for that. I mean, that's not something which, I have to say, whilst I'm not holding my hands up here and saying that my record in government is perfect, because clearly it was not, and like very few people's are. But I don't also think I sort of bear personal responsibility any more than any other Treasury Minister of recent years does. It is a corporate view that needs to be changed within the way we as a state approach this question, because we have become addicted to migration, and that has dramatic consequences along the lines that you just set out. But also it helps to explain some of our productivity problems as well. For years, we've substituted cheap migrant labour for asking business to invest in the kinds of things which would actually allow us to drive innovation and higher levels of productivity. And that gap between us and the United States, which has arisen as a result of this, is part of the reason why we've become poorer as a country as well.
So you don't take personal responsibility for the migration problems, but perhaps collective responsibility.
Yeah.
You apologised there, and you even admitted that the Tory government betrayed its own voters. So my question to you is this. Why should the British public vote for a party that has lied to them in 5 elections? And you're saying to them, trust us on just the 6th time lucky, we'll get it right.
Well, I think that is the key question, right? I mean, and that is a totally fair challenge, because I think we do have to show that we get it. We were punished unbelievably severely in 2024. It was the worst election result in the Conservative Party's history, 40 fewer seats than we got in 1997. I was absolutely confident until the absolute final hours of the campaign that I could hold on, because Labour on Teesside, where I represented, were absolutely not loved. And that the most frustrating thing in the campaign was it was clear there was no enthusiasm for a Labour government, but people just were not going to go out and vote for the Conservatives. And, I therefore was among the 250 odd MPs who lost our jobs. And, in that sense, I think the party is brutally aware of how badly we got this wrong. And there is no hiding place. There is no pretense now that anything other than the most robust immigration control is something which will allow us to even begin to recover. We've seen over the last 18 months that Kemi has set out things which, until recently, would not have just not been Conservative policy, but would probably have led to the loss of the Conservative whip if he'd advanced them as contentions. Leaving the European Convention on Human Rights is now party policy. We now have a plan for legal migration, which expressly rests on the contribution principle, expressly makes clear that if you come to the UK and you commit a crime, or indeed if you claim benefits or use social housing, you will not be eligible to get on a pathway to citizenship, that we will double the time taken to acquire indefinite leave to remain from 5 to 10 years, and push out the point at which you can acquire citizenship to 15 years after arrival. And candidly, I think we need to go, that way and probably further. My own view is that until we show that there is just absolutely no reversion to type on this question, that the Conservative Party will really struggle to win back the faith of the millions of people who rejected us in 24. And there were lots of reasons that came together, but as I say, the objective polling evidence is clear that overwhelmingly it was the failure on the borders that killed us, and that is what we have to get right.
So presumably you're saying the Conservative Party has changed, and that's why you should trust us.
Yeah, well, we have changed. Kemi, is, I think, genuinely very impressive, and I say that as a personal friend of hers. I'm not blind to the fact that obviously does bias you in these things, but I admire her because she is pretty fearless. I think she is also refreshingly free of illusion, right? She understands the depth of the hole into which we have been plunged. And as she's rightly said, we talk right, but govern left. And too often, we did not match rhetoric and outcomes in the way that we said we would. So I think we do get it. I think there's a new generation of Tory MPs as well who really get it. I look at the 24 intake and actually I see, a party which feels very different to some of the people I met when I was first elected in 17, who clearly were not really Conservatives in the way that I was. I have to say, one of the, coming in representing a Teesside seat, in 2017, all I heard about on the doorsteps, frankly, was immigration. And in that context, Corbyn. They were the two sort of big takeaways of that election. But it was really clear that, there were Tory MPs who just didn't want to hear that message. And, we saw, the whole Change UK farce and, that whole wing of the party, which more or less blew itself up over the Brexit question. But the Brexit question was, I think, in many cases, an extension of their willingness to confront the immigration question.
So you talk about the Conservative Party changing, and you admit that immigration was the main reason that you lost that election.
Yeah.
Can you remind viewers who was the Home Secretary at the time of the Boris wave in 2021?
Well, Priti Patel.
And what is her position now?
Priti is the Shadow Foreign Secretary. She is signed up, as every minister in the Shadow Cabinet is, to the party's new policy. She
defended her policy just 2 years ago in 2024, and nothing happened to her. She didn't get sacked. She wasn't reprimanded. She got away with that completely. Is that official Conservative Party policy to defend this stuff?
I think it is fair to say that Priti would not be in her position now if she was not fully signed up to the fact that everything has to change. And, it is the case that Kemi won that leadership election. She won it for a reason, because I'm afraid to say defending our record in a way which would be more comfortable, right? And in many ways, on a human level, would also be more understandable, because Priti is, a pretty tough right winger, really. I mean, that is her whole vibe. I mean, none of us want to admit, that we got things wrong. I mean, that is a very difficult thing in politics to do. I think, however, that in choosing to serve in the Shadow Cabinet, it is accepting that our policy, if we can earn back the right to govern, it will be on the basis we do things very differently.
I think viewers watching this will hear you say Priti Patel is a tough right winger, perhaps with an incredible look on their face, because she was the Home Secretary who let in millions of people, record numbers. More people came in under Priti Patel in that Boris wave period than the previous 1,000 years between 1066 and 1997. Well, it's just unimaginable. I say that she's a right winger.
But she is, right? I mean, if you ask Priti's views on economics, if you ask Priti's views on the Brexit question, if you ask Priti's views on questions including the death penalty, you'll get some pretty robust answers. So the Priti Patel I know is not a shrinking violet, right?
You're not talking about words. I'm talking about what actually she did.
And I think, as I say, the Home Office institutionally was not equipped to advise ministers as to the consequences of the policies that were put in place. When I was in those meetings at the Home Office, it wasn't that Priti was acquiescing in some kind of conspiracy against the public. It was that as an institution, the Home Office was deeply dysfunctional. And
why didn't you change that? It had a majority.
Well, look, there were the circumstances of that last Parliament were horrendous, and at that same time, I was Chief Secretary 21 to 22. We were confronting not only COVID, which occupied unimaginable amounts of time as we tried to navigate that, but also, the latter part of my time as Chief Secretary, we had the Ukraine war kicking off as well, and there were all sorts of things which were cutting across, and not least, of course, the distraction of the Partygate scandal and the attempts to remove Boris as Prime Minister. So it was a perfect storm. We did actually make adjustments in government. I think it is important to say that many of the reasons why immigration is now coming down, it's still too high, but why it is now coming down are the visa changes which were put in place in 2023, which are now starting to bear fruit. So the figures for the financial year to 2025 were about a third net immigration of what it had been in 2022. So we did respond. I'm not here, as I say, to defend it. I own the fact that collectively, we, the Conservative Party, did not do enough on immigration during that time. It is a source of deep regret that we failed in this regard, because believe me, Stephen, it's the opposite of why I came into politics, right? And it is also, incidentally, I am quite certain, it's not for me really to speak for Priti, but I'm certain it's the opposite of what Priti came into politics to achieve as well. None of us set out to sort of, change Britain fundamentally in the way that this immigration wave has done. I think there is a compelling need not only to address future immigration, but also to focus now on the vesting of indefinite leave to remain for many of the people who came in during that period. Because at present, a lot of that number is potentially reversible if the government chooses to reverse it. And I think that is a really important policy debate for this Parliament, because by 2029, it will be too late for Britain to adjust a lot of this. and we should act now to say that, you know, people coming in is different from their acquiring citizenship rights, and there is no automaticity about simply entering the UK and getting to stay here forever. But that is a choice again, and that falls on this government. And I think if they act, they would have the full support of the Conservative Party, but also, I assume, of Reform as well.
Now, you say you're not here to talk for Priti. I would love to talk to Priti. Her office won't get back to me. I've asked for multiple times for interviews over the months. But anyway, that's just putting that point to one side. Do you know who these individuals are?
The short answer is, I'm afraid I don't.
Okay. Well, just you can hold on to
I
them.
suspect they may well be the victims of crime.
They are. They are victims, and I want to explain who they are to you to give you a sense of why people are so angry with the Conservative Party and so angry with people like Priti Patel, who under her watch and under your watch let in, and we talked about legal migration here. Now I want to talk about illegal migration. 150,000 people came in small boats. Those three people. The first one is Thomas Roberts. He was a 21-year-old aspiring Royal Marine who was stabbed in the heart by an illegal migrant in 2022. This illegal migrant came into Britain years earlier in a lorry, claimed that he was 19, or claimed that he was 14, he was actually 19. The Home Office didn't do the proper checks. They put him into a school in Devon in which he was carrying knives and was expelled from the school. They put him with a foster mother. Again, he was making threatening noises, carrying knives. The poor foster mother had reported him to the police. He was carrying a machete, which the police were trying to find him 2 days before he attacked and murdered young Thomas Roberts. It turned out that this migrant had actually committed 2 murders in Serbia previously. And if the Home Office had done proper checks, they would have known this. He was in the system for Interpol. If they'd done proper dental checks, so many opportunities were missed. This was systemic government failure that led to the murder of young Thomas Roberts. Same with poor Rhiannon White, the 27-year-old who was murdered by an illegal migrant with a screwdriver in 2024. Again, he laughed and danced after he murdered her. James Furlong, the other person I met, I showed you a picture of, again murdered in 2020 by a Libyan illegal migrant asylum seeker in a terror attack. These are the people who have suffered, in fact, not just suffered, they've lost their lives as a result of government failure, as a result of your government's failure, systemic failure. How do you respond to that? Do you feel any shame, any guilt, any remorse for this?
I think I feel all of those feelings and I feel anger. I mean, look, illegal immigration is a complete scourge across Western societies, and has been over a long run now. I mean, it's at least a generation, and there is no acceptable level of illegal immigration. You know, when you hear governments start to try and reframe this in terms of irregular migration as opposed to illegal immigration, every one of those people who comes to this country illegally is committing a crime. Every one of them ought to be removed from the United Kingdom without exception. And it is crazy that as a country, we have forgone the ability to remove these people. And that's not, because there isn't a willingness to do it. It's because we have wrapped ourselves in a self-perpetuating and self-extending series of conventions interpreted by judges, most of whom have no accountability to the British public whatever, particularly in regard to the ECHR, and the Strasbourg Court, in a way which has made it impossible for the British state to turn away people who have come here illegally. And look, my actions, I supported, as an MP, I supported moves to leave the European Convention on Human Rights when Jonathan Gullis proposed a backbench bill and forced it to a vote. I was one of the 65 MPs who voted for that. I don't in any way demur from the fact none of these people should have been here. It is utterly tragic, and there, but for the grace of God, goes any one of us who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time when it comes to encountering one of the monsters who did these acts. And it is because of that we must leave the ECHR. And frankly, in my view, we must also look in related terms at the refugee conventions as well, which have been flagrantly abused. It is almost impossible to overstate how visceral the reaction of the British public is on this question. They are fed up to the back teeth of it. I get that. I understand exactly what your viewers will be feeling about this. And I suppose all I can say today, because, I'm not an MP, one day I hope to return as a member of Parliament, but my sincere pledge is this, that I really seriously do not encounter people now in the central right of British politics who disagree that this must end. And actually, the big dividing line now is obviously with the centre left, which continues to believe that international law trumps any form of domestic sovereignty. And that has implications on a whole range of issues. I mean, frankly, it also illuminates issues like Chagos, but it is at the heart of this.
Let's remember these people and let's focus on why they died. And because the people who were let into the country should never, ever have been there.
No.
And you blame judges. You say it would have been impossible for the government to do these things because of a court in Strasbourg. You accept that Parliament is sovereign, and you accept that the Conservative Party had a majority in Parliament.
Yeah.
Therefore, it was on you guys. It was up to you to stop these things happening.
Look,
not Strasbourg, not ECHR.
I mean, Stephen, in 2023, you saw attempts to try and resolve this question, and in 2024, I said that Rishi Sunak should go as Prime Minister because we weren't, frankly, prepared to do whatever it took to stop the small boats, and that was incredibly difficult, right? I mean, it brought down the wrath of God on my head to say that, and it wasn't, as some interpreted it, because I was some sort of bitter Liz or Boris fan who wanted, to sort of settle scores with Rishi. It wasn't that. It was because the Rwanda legislation, which ultimately was our response to this crisis, was not tough enough. It was notionally tough enough. The idea of removing people to Rwanda, I think, has real merit. I mean, it is, frankly, the opposite of where they want to end up. But if you're not prepared to leave the ECHR, then you're never going to get flights off. And that was, I'm afraid, a logic which the then Prime Minister wasn't prepared to accept. But critically, he wasn't prepared to accept it because there was a wing of the Conservative Party who wouldn't have lived with it at that point. And look, that is really my point, that that was a profound split within the Conservative Party in the last Parliament. It is now no longer a debate where it is permissible as a Conservative parliamentarian to be on the other side of that debate. Kemi has made it clear it will be a condition of candidacy in 2029 to accept that we are leaving the ECHR if there is a Conservative government. And, that is long overdue. The battle between the wets and the dries, which sometimes is caricatured, right? I don't think it's always as simple as, sort of saying there's goodies and baddies in this debate, because most people's views are more nuanced than, that is possible to convey. But there is just no room now for the deep self-indulgence of thinking that adhering to treaties which have been abused beyond, frankly, the imagination of the signatories back in the 1950s is somehow more important than avoiding repeats of horrific acts like this.
Well,
those days are done.
You say it's long overdue that the Tory party supports leaving the ECHR. Yeah. Certainly, it was too late and too little for those people who were murdered by illegal migrants. You say in 2023 it was very difficult for you personally to criticise Rishi over this.
Yeah.
The small boats crisis started in 2018. Yeah. You had 5 years.
Yeah,
and you could have sorted this out. You did nothing.
And we saw a series of escalating measures to try and address it. I think really none of which worked, right? And I think that, look, I agree. We ought never. We are not sitting here disagreeing. They did not work, and I suppose my point is that we tried everything within the existing legal framework of Britain in 2026 to close the border to people coming here illegally. We are an island, for God's sake. It ought to be the case that it is impossible, really, to enter here illegally. Certainly impossible to enter here illegally with the resources available to these people. I mean, they're not the Russian special forces. It's people in a dinghy, for God's sake. And we for years we've seen a sort of rather tired debate, which politicians of all parties have joined in, around sort of, oh, shall we do forced turnarounds in the Channel and all of this sort of thing. In practice, that's missing the issue. It just ought to be the case that you kill the incentives for people to come, because they should know that if they come here, they'll be sent straight back where they came from. And we've tested to destruction the idea that our existing legal framework will permit us to do so. So it doesn't bring any of those people back. It doesn't remove the people who, frankly, are laughing at the weakness of the British state now. But what it has done is it has forced the Conservative Party into a position where it does now accept that this must happen. And that is a profound and welcome change. Because, what I would say, and, there is a reason why I haven't joined Reform. That is the other thing to say. Because, I mean, some viewers listening to this might say, well, you're obviously on one wing of the party, and I was one of the Rwanda rebels, along with Rob, along with Suella, along with Danny Kruger, along with Andrea Jenkins. Why haven't you gone? And the reason I haven't gone is I do believe, one, that the Tory party has changed, but I also believe that the Tory party is the better vehicle by far to actually deliver on this stuff in government, because it is not enough to just will this. Just being angry, as we all are, profoundly angry and, embarrassed at where we find ourselves, is not going to fix this. We are going to need enormous rigour over the years ahead to get this change, because it's not one piece of legislation, it's system change. It's removing ourselves from all the international obligations which are trumping the sovereignty of Parliament and, by extension, thwarting the will of the British people. And it's also making sure that our system of government doesn't cut across that. So institutions like the Home Office need to be made fit for purpose, and that involves all sorts of really difficult stuff, which isn't going to be resolved just by shouting at the civil service, right? I mean, I see, I've had a few Twitter spats with Zia. My main objection to him really is that if he turns up at the Home Office and simply calls them a bunch of traitors or fools, that's going to make great headlines for a week, and it's going to get us precisely no further forward over a 5-year horizon. We have got to approach this task with total and relentless purpose, and that is what I believe the Tory party can do, and that's why I'm still part of it.
I suppose that's the disagreement maybe where we're looking at this, because you say the Tory party has changed. I say, Priti Patel still shadow foreign secretary, still defending the Boris wave. That doesn't seem like a change to me. You say you should trust us again. There's that old saying, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Fool me 6 times. I don't know who's to blame there. Again, it's a question of trust, isn't it? That you say that trust us again, give us another 5 years, we'll sort it out. With the British Republic just gave you 14 years, and this utter disaster happened. Again, can you just give us another reason? Why should we trust you again? With all the same.
Well, I suppose there's 2 levels to this. There's the first level is that, as I say, I sincerely believe that Kemi does get this right, and in the same way, and I made this point to you on Twitter, Mrs. Thatcher served in the Heath government, and the Heath government was a total disaster. It gave in on all the issues where it had said it would be strong when it came to the coal strikes in '72. And by that same token, carrying the scars of that experience on her back, she made plans for government which were fundamentally different, radical, brave, necessary, and effective. And I think there is that dimension to this. But actually, just from a position of total electoral cynicism, why would the Tory party fail to grip this now? Because, we are...
Well, why would they do that for 14 years?
Because we're in a position now where it is quite clear that the public are not going to accept deferring this issue. So even if you have the lowest opinion possible of Conservative MPs, it is a matter of straightforward electoral survival to show that we get this, because we've lost seats. I represented a classic marginal seat in the northeast of England. I knew when I came in that one day I would lose. Colleagues lost seats which we'd held for 200 years, effectively. Since the beginning of the mass franchise. And we lost because of immigration. Ironically, the polling is pretty clear, and this is where the Prosper Group are so wrong. That even people who left us to vote Lib Dem were actually motivated by issues like crime and immigration, not by a sudden sort of swing to being liberals. They just voted for the nearest proximate party to get the Tories out. So any Conservative who doesn't get this has a death wish, frankly. And I don't detect many of them.
Well, you talk about Kemi Badenoch, personal friend of yours. She's also someone I would love to interview again. Unfortunately, after months of asking, no luck there. But anyway, I'll have to ask you this question instead. So Kemi, I think, has made some rather odd statements that I'd like you to perhaps clarify. So in 2024, in The Spectator, she wrote, "I find it interesting that everybody defines me as being Nigerian. I identify less with the country than with the specific ethnicity that is Yoruba. That's what I really am. I have nothing in common with the people from the north of the country, the Boko Haram, where the Islamism is. Those were our ethnic enemies, and yet you end up being lumped in with those people. Do you share your leader's ethnic enemies?"
Well, it's not for me to speak for Kemi on these questions, and it's also not for me to speak in terms of parts of a wider argument that she was advancing. I think probably she was being challenged there on issues connected to her, her Nigerian roots, and making a point that there are many different facets to Nigerian.
Well, let me ask you:
identity.
Do you have ethnic enemies?
Well, clearly, I do not have ethnic enemies. Okay. No, I don't.
And you don't mind that your leader does.
But look, what I do know is that Kemi is someone who is deeply proud to be British, and who, in many ways, I think, is the best of what I would want this country to be. What I really hate is the idea which Suella has advanced, which is that somehow she can't ever be British, which I think is a crazy line of argument. Of course, the indigenous population of the country matters and help to define its sense of self. But it is also the case that there are many people who will come to this country who will make a massive contribution and who will, in every way, sign up to the values that we would want to see lived out.
Well, you talk about values. You don't have ethnic enemies.
Yeah.
Is it usual for British people to have ethnic enemies?
Kemi's talking about her Nigerian past and about...
She says she's Yoruba. She says, I don't identify
she's explaining that...
identify as a Yoruba.
She's saying that is the part of Nigeria from where she came from, right? And in the same way that I might talk about, being a northerner, that, and there are differences, right? I mean, coming from an area like Teesside, my upbringing was very different to, say, if I'd grown up in Surrey. Now, there are degrees clearly here, and I'm not in any way, trying to say that I understand the complexities of a country like Nigeria. And Kemi's life experience there is pretty complicated. Her family, from what I understand, went through quite a shattering fall from grace, and that must have been a pretty tough experience for her. Her family were wealthy and successful, and then lost everything, from what I understand. So, it's not, as I say, for me to speak to her experiences there. What I can say is that, I think she is someone who is fiercely proud of the sorts of things that I think you and I and the viewers of this programme believe in. A state that is effective where it needs to be, and frankly bloody tough where it has to be, but also knows its limits. A market economy, a nation which doesn't constantly seek to sort of dissolve itself in supranational identity, but is confident enough to actually say our values and instincts and traditions matter, and is willing to, frankly, to arm itself against the growing threat caused by instability abroad, because there is a real and growing external threat to the UK, which, if you fail to have internal cohesion ready to meet it, is going to lead to Britain suffering some pretty disastrous reverses in the years to come. Kemi does get all of this. I mean, of all the Conservative leaders I have known, she is the toughest. And I say that as someone who is fiercely loyal in many ways to Boris, who I think did do things in office which really mattered, is very loyal in many ways to Liz and the growth agenda which she tried to deliver on. She failed, and she failed for reasons which I think are widely now understood. But she wasn't wrong on the fact that the UK, is too comfortable with being too poor. But Kemi is frankly tougher than either of those two, and she's certainly tougher than Rishi or Theresa. So she gets it.
Putting her ethnic enemies comments to one side, Kemi, you say she's tough and brilliant and everything else. let's look at the opinion polls. She's not cutting through, is she? I mean, the Tories are at, what, 16, 17, 18%?
Well, ironically, I think it's more the case that she's cutting through, but the Tory party isn't. So if you look at her personal ratings now in the polling, she now is, by some measure, the most popular of the party leaders. And that is a change which we've seen since the autumn of last year, and reflects the fact that in a series of occasions, notably the budget speech, but also her conference speech and the stamp duty pledge, even down to sort of more minor things like the very effective way which she dealt with Martin Lewis this week on the question of student debt. She shines and actually cuts through. The problem the Conservative Party has is that our brand remains in deep trouble, and the gap is now more between Kemi's personal popularity and our ongoing struggle to win back trust, because winning back trust is bloody hard. And the big dynamic of the Parliament that we're now in is that, we are still in the doldrums. People, as you have, rightly said, and I take it on the chin, are not going to be quick to forget or forgive all of this stuff. And, I totally respect that. I may hate it, but I totally respect the fact that that's where we are. But the government's fallen apart. I mean, this is a total shambles. Labour is polling in a way which is without precedent. No government has ever created in the way this one has. Even, Starmer's personal ratings are worse than Liz's now, and that was regarded as a sort of almost comedic level of collapse. So Reform's rise is directly correlated to the fact that Labour have disintegrated before the Conservatives can be forgiven. But, my real argument back to Reform is that I do not believe that they are able to make good on the promises they have made. And I appreciate there are lots of people who are probably of the mindset at the moment whereby what could be the harm of giving it a try, because these guys cocked it up and other language is available so badly. And my comeback to them is, don't assume it can't get worse, because it absolutely could, right? The UK's debt position is on an absolute knife edge at all points. And the sort of the notional sense that we recovered our position after the 2022 mini budget is very, very fragile. And we keep seeing this whenever Reeves makes a misstep. I mean, her weeping at the dispatch box caused, gilt yields to spike. Every time there's a risk that Andy Burnham comes in as Labour leader, gilt yields go up. We've got no margin. So if Reform come in and, attempt radical surgery with a hacksaw, and not much more than just a sense that being furious is enough, we could go over the abyss. And, if we want to know what a sovereign debt crisis looks like, look at Argentina. And this country is in need of the most serious form of reality check about how unsustainable our social settlement is, our economic settlement is, our dysfunctionality as a state is. And, there are no easy answers to that. The answers the Conservative Party has at this time are emerging rather than complete. And if you asked Kemi or Neil as her policy chief, they would say as much too. But, with full respect to Robin Suella, who I served with in government, I don't believe they have magic answers either. And I certainly don't believe that Richard Tyson and Zia Youssef do. And I just really caution viewers that, there is a reason why I hope, as a thoughtful and really pretty hardline right-winger, I am not saying, let's just go for reform because it's going to make everything better. It is not the case that I am seeing the kind of analysis or the kind of plan that would give me confidence this can be turned around. I actually worry they might make things even worse. And if they were to win and fail, and you have a new wave of disillusionment sweeping through our politics, I think that gets very messy indeed. And I worry about the radical right, the really radical right, and I worry about the really radical left. And we'll see what happens in the Gorton and Denton by-election, for example. But if the Greens start to, emerge onto the scene in a serious way. That's just another risk of a country which has become increasingly unserious. We've got to find a way back to the rigour of the Thatcher years. That's the stand, not necessarily the policies of the Thatcher years, but the rigour of the Thatcher years, the depth of the analysis, the strength of the conviction, the willingness, frankly, to govern in the spirit that it doesn't matter whether you win re-election, but that you get things right. And I only see that with Kemi. I in no way downplay how massive the task of winning back power is, but I do believe she is the best person to do it.
Okay, Simon Clarke, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.